The night started the way most nights in London started in 1967. Someone's flat, someone's party, a room full of people who were changing music and didn't quite know it yet. Jeff Beck was 23 years old and had been out of the Yardbirds for less than a year. He was already leading his own group. Rod Stewart was singing for him. The album wasn't finished yet, but people who'd heard early recordings were talking. Not everyone was sure what to make of it, but they were talking. Jimi Hendrix was different. Hendrix had arrived in London the year before from New York, unknown, carrying a Stratocaster and a sound nobody had heard before. In 12 months, he'd become the most talked about guitarist in Britain. Every musician in the city was trying to figure out how he did what he did. Most of them couldn't get close enough to find out. They moved in the same circles without quite crossing paths. You could spend 3 months in London's music scene in 1967 and know someone without ever being in the same room at the same time. It was like that until it wasn't. The flat belonged to a journalist named Stephen Ward. Not the Stephen Ward from the scandal, just a man with the same name who happened to know everyone worth knowing. He hosted these evenings a few times a year. No real agenda, decent wine, good records playing low, and people who had things to say to each other if you gave them enough space. Beck arrived around 10. Hendrix was already there. They'd met briefly before. A handshake at someone else's show, a nod across a crowded room. Nothing that amounted to a real conversation. Beck remembered Hendrix's performance at the Savile Theater a few weeks earlier. He'd stood at the back of the room and watched the whole set without moving. He hadn't talked about it with anyone afterward. He wasn't sure what he would have said. The room had maybe 20 people, mostly musicians, a couple of music journalists, one producer who was working with both camps at different points. Someone had brought an acoustic guitar that was leaning against the wall near the kitchen door. A Martin. Nobody was playing it. Beck found a spot near the window and stayed quiet. That was his way at gatherings like this. He wasn't good at parties, and he'd stopped pretending otherwise sometime around 1965. Hendrix was across the room, glass in hand, talking to someone. He had a way of taking up space without trying. Not loudly, just presence. The kind you feel before you identify where it's coming from. Beck watched him without watching him, the way you watch someone when you're trying not to be obvious about it. At some point, Hendrix looked over. He crossed the room. "You were at the Savile," Hendrix said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah," Beck said. Hendrix nodded slowly, like that confirmed something he'd already suspected. He looked at the window for a second, then looked back. "Why don't you ever burn it?" Beck looked at him. "The guitar," Hendrix said. "You never burn it?" Beck didn't answer right away. There was a version of this that was a dig. There was a version that was a genuine question. The tone sat somewhere between the two, and maybe that was deliberate. "Because the guitar isn't the point," Beck said. Hendrix tilted his head slightly, not dismissively, more like he found that interesting and wasn't sure yet if he believed it. "What's the point then?" Beck didn't answer. Not because he didn't have one, he just didn't say it out loud. Across the room, someone had picked up the Martin. They played 2 chords, listened, put it back down. Hendrix glanced at it. Then he looked at Beck. "You want to play something?" Beck crossed to the guitar without hurrying. He picked it up the way you pick up something familiar that belongs to someone else. Carefully, but without ceremony. He didn't check the tuning. He just sat down on the arm of a sofa and started playing. It wasn't anything with a name. Nothing from any record, his or anyone else's. He started with 3 notes that didn't quite resolve, and then instead of resolving them, he moved somewhere else entirely. Something adjacent. Something that made the unresolved notes feel like they'd been right all along. He was playing acoustic, unplugged, in a room full of conversation, and somehow, inside 30 seconds, the room got quieter. Not because anyone decided to be quiet, because something was happening and they felt it before they understood what it was. Hendrix stood and watched. His glass was still in his hand. At some point he stopped lifting it. He just held it at his side and watched Beck's hands. Beck played for maybe 3 minutes. He didn't look at anyone. He wasn't performing. He was doing something else. Something that looked from the outside like thinking out loud, except the thinking was coming through his fingers. Each phrase felt like a sentence that wasn't quite finished, and then the next phrase picked it up exactly where the last one left off. When he stopped, he put the guitar back against the wall. He looked at Hendrix. Hendrix looked at the guitar. Neither of them said anything for a while. Not silence as in no one was talking. The room had picked back up around them. Someone was laughing near the door. A record had started playing somewhere in another room. But between the two of them, in that specific corner of that flat, there was something with weight to it. "What was that?" Hendrix finally said. "Not the music specifically. Something broader." "What is that thing you're doing? Where does that come from?" "I don't know," Beck said. "Yes, you do." Beck looked at him. "Maybe." That was it. Someone else came over to talk to Hendrix. The conversation moved on the way conversations move at parties. Sideways, then gone. Beck got a drink and found the window again. But something had happened in that corner. Both of them knew it, and neither of them said so. The producer who was there that night was a man named Michael Delaney. He worked mostly in jazz but crossed into rock when it suited him. He talked about that evening in a 1991 interview for a British music magazine. "Jimmy watched everything," Delaney said. "He was always watching people in rooms. But that night he watched differently. He wasn't studying technique. He was watching like he was trying to understand the language. Like he'd heard a word he didn't recognize and was trying to place it." The interviewer asked what happened when Beck finished. "Jimmy held his glass," Delaney said. "Just held it. Didn't drink, didn't speak, didn't move." He paused. "I've been in rooms with a lot of musicians. I've seen a lot of reactions to a lot of things. But I've rarely seen someone go quiet in a way that was about more than the music. That was about more than the music." Beck didn't think about that night often. Moving forward was his default. He didn't tend to look backward at specific moments and label them. But in the months that followed, he noticed something shifting. Not technically. Something in the structure of what he chose to say with the guitar. Certain notes he used to fill, he started leaving empty. Certain phrases he used to resolve, he started letting hang. He couldn't explain it and didn't try. The Jeff Beck Group's first album came out in 1968. Truth, raw and loud and deliberately unfinished sounding. Rod Stewart's voice writing over riffs that seemed to be in a controlled kind of hurry. Critics didn't know exactly where to put it. Some of them called it sloppy. Some of them called it honest. Both were right. But buried inside certain moments on that record, a note held a beat too long, a phrase that turned sideways when you expected it to go forward. There was something that sounded like a question that hadn't been answered yet. Most people didn't notice it. A few did. Hendrix died in September 1970. He was 27 years old. He died in a flat in Notting Hill on a Monday morning, and the news went through the music world the way news like that always goes. Fast and wrong at first, and then too real. Beck heard it from someone on the phone. He didn't say much. There wasn't much to say that fit. He went to the funeral. He didn't speak publicly. There was nothing to say that belonged in a room like that, and Beck had never been good at saying things in rooms anyway. He thought about that night, the Martin against the wall, the way the room went quiet without anyone asking it to, the question Hendrix had asked him, "Why don't you ever burn it?" and his own answer, the half of an answer he'd given, "Because the guitar isn't the point." He hadn't finished the thought. Hendrix hadn't pushed for the rest, and now the whole thing had a hard edge to it, the kind that doesn't soften with time, but changes shape. It becomes something else, something you carry differently. He didn't talk about it to anyone. Years passed. Beck kept playing. He put out records that refused to belong to any category. He quit touring when he felt like quitting. He fired band members and hired them back. He walked away from things at the height of them and came back on his own terms. He was difficult in the specific way that people are difficult when they've decided not to pretend. He won every award available to win. He played arenas. He played small venues because he felt like it. He never burned his guitar, not once, not a single time. In 2016, a journalist sat with Beck for a long-form piece about his influence on 3 decades of guitarists. They talked for a few hours. Beck was in his early 70s by then, still playing, still recording. At some point, the conversation drifted toward the late 60s. The journalist mentioned Hendrix, not the night at the party, just Hendrix generally as a reference point. Beck was quiet for a moment. "There was a night," he said. He stopped there. The journalist waited. He asked me why I never burned the guitar, Beck said. I gave him half an answer. I said the guitar isn't the point. He looked at his hands for a second. I never got to finish it. The journalist asked what he would have said. Beck thought about it. Not performing the thinking, actually thinking. That the burning is the performance, he said. And I was never interested in the performance. I was interested in the question underneath it. He was quiet for a second. Jimmy asked me the right question that night. That's what made me play. Not to answer him, the question itself, just having it in the room. He paused. I've been trying to finish that answer for 50 years. He didn't say anything else on the subject. The journalist moved to something else, but he kept that part. He said later it was the truest thing Beck had said to him in the entire afternoon. Maybe in any interview. The flat where that evening happened is gone now in the way buildings go. The address still exists, but the rooms are different. The walls have been repainted a dozen times. The layout has changed. The corner where someone leaned a Martin guitar against the wall is gone. The music Beck played is gone too. No tape rolling, no recording, just 20 people in a room, most of whom remember different details, and one thing every single one of them agreed on when asked years later. Jimi Hendrix stood with a glass in his hand and forgot to drink from it. For 3 minutes, he just listened. And when it was over, he didn't say what he was thinking. He asked a different question instead. And Beck answered it the only way he ever answered anything. Not with words. He picked up the guitar. That was always the only answer he had.